Our next presenter is the recipient of the OFAH Oakville and District Rod and Gun Club OFAH Zone G Wildlife Research Grant. Please welcome Keith Munro to the stage.
Well, thank you very much for having me here, and thank you very much for this grant. I've gotten a lot of great support from the OFAH over the years, and I've always really appreciated it. So today I'm going to be talking about my research, which involves incorporating deer response to hunter behavior into management practices. Now, even though this is a deer talk, before I can talk about deer, I need to talk briefly about wolves and elk in Yellowstone National Park, because it's research on those two animals that have formed the basis for a lot of my work. So in the late 90s, wolves were reintroduced into Yellowstone Park after about almost a 100-year absence. And that meant that the elk had to adapt and respond to this new source of danger that wolves presented. And they did this by altering their habitat use based on how dangerous they perceived certain areas. So they would avoid areas they thought were higher risk and use areas they thought are lower risk. And this sort of perception of danger across a landscape has been given the catchy term landscape of fear. Biologists are notoriously bad at giving things catchy names, but this was one case where they kind of got it right. And what they actually found was that as elk started to avoid certain areas, the plants in those areas that had been really heavily overbrowsed by elk, to the point where there was absolutely no recruitment into like the adult class of especially trees like birch and poplar, they found that those areas had a chance to regenerate. And this is important from a management point of view because it's an example of how a problem associated with an overabundant, well, in this case, elk population, was resolved not by changing the size of the elk population, but by changing the behavior of the animals in that population. So what I'm interested in is how do humans, in their own actions, create one of these landscapes of fear for deer? Humans, in most areas where deer are of a management concern, are the primary predators. And then how do deer respond to this landscape? And then finally, can we actually use this response to reduce human-deer conflict? So what I tried to do with this project was get the three big players in this system. So we used a mail survey to look at how landowners make the decision to allow or exclude hunters from their property and therefore set up safe areas. I used GPS trackers to look at how hunters move on the landscape and offer risk. And then I looked at deer response using trail cameras to look at deer behavior and GPS collars to look at deer habitat movements, or just deer movements in general. Oh, sorry. Just for the sake of time, I'm going to focus on the two projects on the right-hand side of the screen. This is actually the shortest I've ever given this talk, but if you're interested in the big talk, just come speak to me afterwards. I'm always happy to talk to any groups that will pretty much hear me. So today I'm going to talk about the hunter movement data and the GPS and the deer movement data from the GPS collars. And almost all of our research, with the exception of the mail survey, took place in Marlborough Forest. Marlborough Forest is a really large chunk of city-owned property just south of the city of Ottawa proper, and it has a really high winter deer population and also has a really high hunter population that use a whole host of methods to hunt deer. So with the help of the OFAH, the city of Ottawa, and then just word of mouth, I recruited hunters for the 2011, 12, and 13 hunting seasons to carry GPS trackers when they hunted. All they did was they turned on the tracker when they started hunting and wore it on a backpack or a sleeve or a belt, and it logged a point every minute. It was really good response. I had over 50 hunters take part, and also some of them donated their tracking data from their GPS dog collars. And what I learned was you can't lump hunter movements all into one group. Well, we all knew this because different hunters move differently, but now we were able to quantify it. And this is really important when you are going to look at how deer respond to that movement. So what I'm going to show you is three of these movement maps for three different hunters in the 2013 season. All these hunters hunted for a week, and all of them were successful in harvesting a deer. And as I go through these different methods, pay attention to that scale bar on the bottom of the map. So this hunter was hunting out of a pair of tree stands, as you can see from the two clusters of points. And so she basically went from her car to her stands and back. So not a whole lot of movement across the landscape. Now, if you add stalking into the mix, it really bumps up the area that you're interacting with, and also then the area on which the deer have to interact with you as a hunter. So this hunter was hunting out of stands, but was also stalking deer across the landscape. And then once you bring dogs into the mix, you dramatically really bump up to a whole nother scale of movement. So this hunter was moving across a huge part of the area, and that was possible because of this. So this is the movement from just one of his hunting dogs from that same period of time. And I think his gang was running 6 dogs at a time. And this difference in mobility is really important when we then look at how the deer react to the different types of hunting. So to get that data, we carried out 3 years of tracking collaring projects in Marlborough Forest. Marlborough Forest is a deer yard, so there's really high densities of deer there in the winter, as well as really nicely groomed snowmobile trails, thanks to the Rideau Valley Snowmobile Club, which I always feel like I should thank. We captured deer predominantly using this method, which are box traps. We deployed 105 collars over the 3 years, and probably 80 to 90% of them were with these traps. The bulk of our data comes from 30 yearling and adult does that were fitted with these GPS tracking collars. The collars are of a fixed diameter, so we couldn't put them on anything that's going to grow like a buck or grow like a fawn or swell up in the rut like a buck. The collars are great. They give you a location accurate to 4 or 5 meters, and they'll give you a location as often as you want. For battery purposes, we were getting fixes about every half hour. So once again, really good spatially specific data on how deer are responding to hunters. So I'm going to show you 2 maps of the habitat shifts of 2 different deer in response to hunting. So the green lines each of these lines represents a 2-week home range. So the area within one of the sets of lines represents the area the deer use for a 2-week period. The green represents the 2 weeks before the gun hunt, the red represents the 2 weeks of the gun hunt, and the orange represents the 2 weeks after the gun hunt. So you can see that in response to hunting, this doe really contracted her range. The area she contracted into is pretty heavy swamp, and I haven't broken it down by time of day, but I would bet that the sort of bottom blob or bottom portion of the red habitat in the swamp is her nocturnal or her daily habitat, and then the fields to the north are her nocturnal habitat. Now, by comparison, this doe didn't show any sort of range contraction at all. She actually bumped up her range a little bit during the hunt. And the big difference between these 2 deer, and this is a pattern I've seen in other deer as well, is that the deer that had range contractions was exposed to just human hunters, as opposed to the one that didn't have range contractions was exposed to hunters using dogs. And I think the reason for this is, if you go back to, remember the slides about the mobility that that using dogs offered, if you're a doe and you're just faced, or any deer, and you're just faced with humans, and you contract your range, you can go areas where it's unlikely that a human hunter is going to go. But when you're faced with dogs who are as mobile or more mobile than you are, there's really no advantage to doing that range contraction. I still have to do a lot of the spatial analysis on this, but that seems to be the pattern we're seeing. And this goes back to that using behavior as a management tool, because what we see here is one really specific behavioral response, which is the contraction of home ranges, in response to a specific hunting practice, so hunting without dogs. And if you remember that doe, she contracted her range, she moved away from roads, which could have implications for reducing deer vehicle collisions, and she moved out of fields, which could have implications for reduced crop damage. And those are the sort of relationships I'm trying to identify and then make suggestions of. And in terms of the importance to the OFAH, or just deer management in general, I think there's 2 points. The first is that this is a new tool for managing deer that exists within the framework we have right now. Using citizen hunters to control the size of the deer population is really well established across all of North America. And so this would be incorporated into that process, as opposed to getting a whole new paradigm for managing deer. And the second is that I think it may be able to address like the core challenge of deer management, which is that you have some stakeholders that want more deer for more hunting and more wildlife viewing opportunities, and you have another group of stakeholders that want less deer because they want less problems. So by using behavior to control the problems, we may be able to break that link and have a larger deer population that causes less problems because we're dealing specifically with the behavior. So that's the ongoing project. Like I said, I could only cover about half of it, but I'm always happy to chat about deer afterwards. I have a lot of great collaborators and partners for this project. Like I said, OFAH has been really helpful both in financial support, but also in helping me recruit hunters and getting the word out there for participants in my project. Now I'm not going to remember who I have to thank. That's okay. I do my work through Trent University, joint with the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forests, Wildlife Management and Resource Section. And then the City of Ottawa and the National Capital Commission let me work on their land. And then finally, the one group I always want to make sure I thank is the hunters and landowners of EBC Ontario, because there's been a huge amount of public buy-in on this project. Like I said, 50 hunters that have taken part in the tracking. People let us go on their land to track the deer. Hunters let us use their hunt camps for deer capture work. And I've never turned down or actually eaten as much free food as I get when I'm visiting hunt camps during the hunt. It's a problem sometimes. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Keith, for a very informative presentation. And as Keith said, we only have a short time for each of the presenters to actually talk about their research projects. And if they had the opportunity, they'd probably talk for a lot longer because they're really passionate about what they do. So please take some time to chat with each and every one of them tonight and this afternoon. So the Oakville and District Rod and Gun Club and OFH Zone G have been longtime supporters of the OFH Research Grant Program. This year, they've joined forces to sponsor the Wildlife Research Grant. So I'm going to try this one more time. Would Rob Hare, Chair of OFH Zone G, please join me on stage? It worked this time.
Do know